China has just forgiven a chunk of Cameroon's debt. Normally, that'd be something to brag about. Except China kept it a secret. Why is China keeping quiet about writing off Cameroon's debt? Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Debt relief. When a country lets another country off the hook for paying back loans. As in, no more debt. What a relief. If only they did that for student loans. Specifically, my student loans. Usually when rich creditor countries forgive the debts of poorer countries, there's a ton of publicity to highlight all that generosity. Like that time 20 years ago when Bono worked with world leaders to get them to forgive more than $100 million in loans to the poorest countries.
Take your time and get your head around this fact. The national debt of the 18 poorest countries in Africa has been cancelled thanks to Bono.
The point is, everyone loves publicity. Which is why it's weird that when China recently wrote off a chunk of debt owed by Cameroon, it was all super hush-hush. And then reporters asked, why the secrecy? In fact, the world might never have even known China forgave a chunk of Cameroon's debt, if not for a gaffe by the Chinese language edition of the Wall Street Journal. It reported, based on a statement from the president of Cameroon, that China had agreed to write off $5 billion of Cameroon's debt. Since that's almost all the debt that Cameroon has ever borrowed from China, that news report caused a bit of controversy online. Last September, Chinese leader Xi Jinping pledged some $60 billion in aid, investment, and loans to Africa at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. That created some backlash, including Chinese netizens asking why China was giving money away to nearly failed states in Africa when in China there are at least 30 million people who live on less than $1 a day. As you can imagine, those questions were then censored. Actually, it was at that meeting in September where Cameroon's president, Paul Biya, pleaded with Chinese authorities to ease his country's debt burden, according to Chinese media. But it turns out, when the Wall Street Journal said China forgave $5 billion in debt, well, it was kind of not quite accurate. The actual amount was $78 million. That's a big difference. It's like reporting that the new tower is as tall as the Empire State Building, when actually it's only one story tall with a low ceiling. Now, Chinese media had a field day with this, with the Global Times calling it a huge blunder for US media, and other Chinese media accusing foreign media of planting fake news for Chinese readers. But if it weren't for the Wall Street Journal's mistake, the world might never have known of China's generosity. See, Cameroon still owes China about $3 billion in total debt, so the $78 million in debt forgiveness is actually really small. So now it should be clear why China might have wanted to keep it a secret. It's not really a PR win. I mean, $78 million is less than what one rock star with sunglasses can do. But there's another reason the Chinese regime might have wanted to keep it a little under wraps. Reporters might start to suspect that the Chinese regime plans to use debt relief to get something in return. Remember the story of how China got Sri Lanka to cough up a port? China lent billions to Sri Lanka, no strings attached, and when they couldn't pay it off, China asked for Hanbantota Port. And China got it. Sri Lanka was forced to sign a 99-year lease in exchange for waiving off about $1 billion in debt. So I guess there were strings attached. Plus, the deal gave China control of territory right near its arch-rival India, as well as a strategic foothold along a critical commercial and military waterway. Unconditional debt forgiveness? That's for suckers. Setting up a long-term lending relationship so you can get something in return that gives you a geostrategic advantage? Now that's the kind of lending relationship the Chinese regime likes. Xi Jinping calls it win-win mutual cooperation. I like to call it debt trap diplomacy. For more on that, you can watch my episode 5 Countries That Have Fallen Into China's Debt Trap for all the sordid details of how China leverages debt to get what it wants. Yes, money. The key to a successful communist regime. Wow, I forgot there was a time when I didn't have a beard. Anyway, Why would the Chinese regime care about Cameroon? Well, for one, mineral resources, like bauxite, iron ore, and gold. And don't worry, Chinese gold mining operations there are totally legit and have no problems whatsoever. Okay, a few minor problems. But look, there's another reason China cares about Cameroon. Let's go back to that map. Cameroon sits along the Gulf of Guinea, and that's a good place to be when doing trade with a dozen other countries, like Nigeria. So it should come as no surprise that China has invested $1.2 billion to convert a fishing town called Kribi into the region's biggest deep-water port.
The Kribi Industrial Port Complex is made up of four main parts: a deep-water port with roughly 20 wharfs, a zone for industrial and logistics activity, a multimodal transport corridor, a new city.
And Cameroon's Kribi port is connected to a pipeline project to bring in oil from landlocked Chad. There's also a $436 million highway China is funding there. It ties the port with Cameroon's resource-rich inland area. And there are also plans to build a railroad directly to a deposit of iron ore. And those iron mines will definitely not have problems. So far, it doesn't look like Cameroon has had to directly give up any of its infrastructure or resources for the $78 million in debt forgiveness. But the Chinese Communist Party's overall actions in Cameroon are clearly the same strategy it has used around the world: make gigantic loans, get countries in debt, and forgive the debt in exchange for small things like all of their resources or strategic infrastructure. Win-win mutual cooperation, which means that China-Cameroon relations should be something to keep an eye on. And before we go, it's time for me to answer a question from one of you who supports China Uncensored by contributing $1 or more through the crowdfunding website Patreon. David Schwimmer asks, Happy Valentine's Day! It seems like the recent love that Putin and Xi have shared, particularly in Eastern Europe and Venezuela, could be undermined by recent NBC media exposure. What do you all think of this? I see you're referring to this map from NBC's Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. There are several problems with this map. Among them, China has taken over all of Russia, plus Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. But don't worry, Xi and Putin can't be torn apart that easily. From holding joint press conferences, to cooking delicious Chinese pancakes, to cooking delicious Russian pancakes, to putting friendship medals on each other, it's the relationship between China and Russia that is truly unbreakable. Thanks for your question, David. And as always, I hope all of our supporters on Patreon will continue to leave thoughtful, interesting questions within each Patreon post, so I can answer them on the show. Visit patreon.com/China Uncensored to see what you can do to support the show. You guys keep the lights on here at China Uncensored. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.